So hello everybody, and those of you who joined me on previous webinars, nice to see you back again. And you also know that I'm about to switch my camera off because I find myself really distracting when I'm talking. Have just been given a top tip about how to do that differently next time, but for today I'm going to switch it off and I'll bring it back on obviously when we get to questions later on. So we're back again. I think this should be called something like the coronavirus, navigating coronavirus for employers or something like that, because we have every month we're almost getting something different that you're having to navigate, and hopefully we are helping you to kind of find your way through. So I've just realised that that's the slide that Lisa already just talked to. So what we're going to be covering is a little bit on your options about retaining employees after furlough ends. So this is a little bit of a precursor to the new scheme. And I'll cover a little bit about the job retention bonus as well, just as a reminder for you about that. And then understanding the new job support scheme itself, including a little bit about eligibility. And trying to look at what might be the best ways of you using the scheme, limiting costs. You might have seen a little bit in the press about that this week. We were hoping that there was going to be some updated guidance released in advance of the webinar. With the furlough scheme, I think we saw some new guidance being released within a week. Unfortunately, we haven't had any yet. So what we're going to be talking about is what's available currently. But hopefully through the Q&A we can work through a little bit of analysis of that, and then if we get some more guidance coming out maybe later on today or something like that, what we might do is look to see if we can provide some FAQs or something just as a bit of an update for you, or if people think that there's a need for it, maybe we can look at another webinar on another date. So I'm then going to look at the transitioning staff over to the new scheme, because I think the government make it sound all so simple. From the 1st of November, you can just move your staff to the new scheme. But we know, anybody who's joined me on a previous webinar knows it's not that straightforward. So I'm going to have a chat through how to transition staff over from a contractual perspective. And then I've added a little bit in about self-isolation payments, just because it's something it might be useful to know about if you don't. I won't talk about it for a long time. And I'm just going to briefly cover the Kickstart scheme, just because, again, it might be something that might be useful to you. I'm not sure if you'll know much about it. And then I'm going to do a brief little action plan for you, and then there'll be your opportunity to ask any questions. So, we covered last time round, all the different months, what you could do with the coronavirus the retention scheme previously, how you could utilise the best out of that scheme. So I thought I'd just do a little bit of a revisit of that, seeing as we're only at the start of October. So this is about looking at what can we do in October while people are still furloughed. So you can instruct staff to take any accrued and untaken annual leave. Some employers haven't done that throughout furlough, some have, but I think if you've got staff with a lot of leave potentially to take, you could be in a situation where they're coming back to work with all of that leave. You may have work available for them to do, and they've then got leave that they need to take. So take the opportunity to instruct them to take their leave, as long as you give them double the length of notice of the leave that they can take. So if they're going to take a week's leave, give them 2 weeks notice. Obviously that only gives you opportunity for them to take a week in October, but again, if you give them another lot of notice, then potentially you can get them a little bit earlier into November as well. So have a look at how much they've got to take and maybe try to encourage them to take some leave. And obviously if they're on furlough and you're not paying them anything other than your percentage at the moment, you will need to top them up to full pay for the days that they are on annual leave. Then there's looking at whether you can bring people back to work part-time. You might have already been doing that, obviously, because you've been able to do that since July. But again, if you haven't, it might be an opportunity to test out bringing people back to part-time, especially if you're thinking about transitioning to a job support scheme. Start to see whether you have got a need for those individuals to do that work. Test it out a little bit while you can still rely on the coronavirus retention scheme. So that's again about making sure you have actually got work that they can do. It's an opportunity also to put staff on training, because there's no disruption to the workplace while you can put them on training. Remembering also, if they are on training, that they should be paid full pay for if they're attending full days of training. For example, if it's just a bit of CPD, then you don't obviously need to pay them full pay. They can do that while they're on furlough. And this is the time as well to maximise consultation. So we're going to be talking a little bit about changing contracts. This is an opportunity to actually start your consultation process, start a restructure, or potentially make redundancy. So you will be retaining them potentially past October, because you haven't got as much time if you just started earlier in the year. But any staff with short service, you haven't got to give them as much notice, so you can potentially make those changes in October while they're on furlough. You can consult with them, and furlough's covering that wage. Whereas obviously once you get to November, if you start consultation, then you're then back into, you can't utilise that time that they are paid furlough payments. Okay, so what we're going to cover in respect then of the other options for you to consider are alternative roles and thinking about potential secondment opportunities. And I know a few people who have taken advantage of this and find it really useful. Changes to terms and conditions, which obviously we're going to cover in a bit more detail, and taking periods of leave. So the first thing to think about with alternative roles is whether that with some training you could move people to a different role. Now, it may be that if it's not much of a change, you wouldn't need to consult with them on that change. And I think to a degree, it's now people are potentially happier to move to different roles than they might have been previously, because I think for some people, they will just be happy to be remaining in employment. So this might give you opportunities to diversify what you do as a business. So you might be thinking, well, I've got some staff, they don't do what with new business does, but with a bit of training, we can potentially move them to that. So they can be trained while on furlough, as I said, and then obviously you've only got to top up their pay for the hours that they're undertaking training and not working. So if they're working a full day, training a full day, then obviously you need to top their salary up. You can utilise the scheme, as I said, maximising the benefit and the skills development of the individuals that you employ then in the medium term. So as I said, you do need to think, if you are changing the roles significantly, you can only do it legitimately with the employee's agreement. So if they do agree to the change of role, and you've got the work for them to do, then great, you can look to move them to an alternative role, which might be an alternative to redundancy for them. And moving then on to secondment. So it may be that you don't have any work for people to do in the short term, but once things pick up, you will have work available. Lots of people obviously in live entertainment, sports areas, that are in that situation at the moment. But what people might not have thought of is, if you've got a good relationship maybe with one of your suppliers, one of your customers, who might actually be able to take on your member of staff for an agreed period of time on a secondment basis. So technically, they still work for you and you retain their skills in the long term, but while you haven't got work available for them, they work for that alternative employer. They remain on contract to you, and you second them out, and then you bring them back when you're ready to bring them back. Obviously, there's a little bit of a risk to that they might decide that they prefer working for your supplier or your customer, and you could lose that member of staff. But if you might lose them anyway because you haven't got work to give them, it might be a way of retaining them in the longer term. And as I said, I already know a couple of companies who've done this and done it really successfully. And it's actually helped their understanding of how their supplier works better and improve the relationship between them as well. So there are potential benefits to looking at this as an opportunity. And then looking at changing terms and conditions. So without wanting to sound too mercenary, I don't think there's ever been a better time in recent years to make changes to terms and conditions that employees are contracted under. They're more likely to be accepted now because the alternative is not as good as it might have been at other times. So although in my, I've actually seen there are lots of jobs being advertised out there, they might not be the same job as somebody's doing now. So what you could look at changing could offer a new contract potentially with a different salary. Maybe if you have previously been able to afford more attractive annual leave, more attractive sick pay, it could be an opportunity to say, for a period of time even, we're going to pare that back. We're only going to pay what's statutory, and we're going to, this is part of our survival, and we're going to pare that back, give you less favourable conditions if you're happy to remain in employment. And again, I'll go through how you change that contract if that is something that you look to do. So again, this is one of the things to be really mindful of, and I've heard some horrific examples of this during furlough, is you need to make sure that the changes are fair, they're transparent across the board. So they're not just picking on your minimum wage staff or picking on a certain group of staff. I heard a really awful example last week of a group of IT technicians who, for example, their pay was protected up to 100% during furlough, and all of the admin staff, who were pretty much all female, all of their furlough payments were only retained at 80%. So looking at something that is the same across the board. If you're proposing, for example, a 20% pay cut across the entire company, that means that it starts at the top and the CEO takes a 20% pay cut as well, because it's much more likely to be accepted if it feels fair to people and you're not just picking on some lower paid groups. And I totally appreciate that actually you might have some really valuable skill sets that you want to retain, that you think, gosh, they can probably walk into another job. I couldn't really ask them to take a pay cut. But you really need to think about the scheme and make sure that it feels fair, or that other people might accept why some people are being treated slightly differently. So this is, and again, as I say, it might be something that you can actually do just for a fixed period of time. Say, we want to do this for 3 months, or we want to do this for 6 months. We'll keep it under review. This is about everybody in this together, hopefully keeping the company alive, and keeping as many staff as you possibly can. So, and I know I've mentioned in my last webinar about surveying your employees. I mean, some of you will know your staff well. You don't need a survey. You've probably been talking to them throughout the last few months. But ask them about solutions that they might have. And I'm sure some of you will have already done this, but sometimes they'll come up with solutions that you hadn't thought of. But also it gives you a good idea about whether they're up for some alternative ways of coming back in order to ensure that they keep a job and some income rather than being made redundant. And especially because potentially they may be able to top up with universal credit benefits or some other benefits. So it's about being creative and trying to retain staff, especially if you know once things get back to normal, when they get back to normal, then you're going to want to have those staff back as they were before. And another thing to think about is this taking periods of leave. So again, like we've already talked about, an opportunity to take annual leave, but also it may be, and I've had, again, lots of people who've offered to take periods of unpaid leave rather than be made redundant. And they've said, actually, I can take a period of unpaid leave for 3-6 months. Obviously, not everybody's going to be in a situation where they can afford to do that, but some have. And then they said, and we'll review the redundancy again then in 3-6 months' time. And if then we still need to, we've done, again, as much as we can. So for some people will want that unpaid leave. So it might just be something to think about. if you can justify it and it saves you money. And again, it may be that people take unpaid leave and perhaps they do some training outside of the organisation or something like that, and they increase their skill set ready for when they come back. So the other thing to think about in terms of retaining employees, and I said I was going to mention it, is the job retention bonus. So most of you probably already looked at whether you can get this. So it's the bonus of £1,000 that I think Rishi Sunak announced back in July, I think, when he brought in the updated scheme. And it's essentially, if you have staff who are on the books from the 1st of November 2020 to the 31st of January 2021, then you can potentially receive this bonus in February. Now, the employees had to have been eligible for the job retention scheme. And I believe, because a couple of different advice is slightly different on this, but I believe that you had to have claimed under that scheme as well to be able to be entitled to the job retention bonus. So obviously this was a way of trying to encourage you to keep staff once the furlough scheme ended. You keep those staff in place for a period of 3 months and you can potentially be entitled to a bonus of £1,000. So moving on then to the job support scheme itself, this is a little bit of an infographic showing kind of how the scheme works. I've seen lots of different ones of these, but essentially the scheme is designed to protect viable jobs. We obviously don't have lots of detail on exactly what will be classed as a viable job, but I will cover it in a little bit of detail in terms of what we do know. So this is about businesses facing lower demand over the winter months. Although, interestingly enough, you don't have to prove that you're facing lower demand over the winter months. This is about keeping employees attached to the workforce, hopefully for 6 months. Although, obviously, if you do have to make staff redundant within that time, they don't have to stay with you for 6 months for you to be able to claim. What we do know is that the payments will be made retrospectively. You won't be able to claim until December. And we know that there's supposed to be detailed guidance coming out. And as I said, we haven't had that yet. We know that the Chancellor's working with unions and business leaders developing that. So that's probably what's taking the time. But effectively, this is a short time working agreement, and anybody who was on the last webinar will know we talked about that a little bit. So it's pretty much the same as furlough, really, in that it's a short time working arrangement, but it's not as generous as the previous furlough scheme was. So the amount that the government are topping up is not obviously as much as they were topping up last time. But effectively, as you're aware, employers, you'll be able to reduce employees' working time to as little as 1/3 of their regular hours, and then continue to pay them for the normal hours worked. And then they'll have wages topped up to cover 2/3 of the pay lost by the reduction in hours, and you pay 1/3 and the government pays 1/3. That's based on 1/3. I've got another infographic that'll show you that where you can work out if they're working more than 1/3. So we'll look at that as well. So as we said, that you will need to pay the employee up front the full amount, and then you basically claim the grant back retrospectively from the government in arrears. So little bit different. But as we know, the government's contribution is going to be capped at £697.92 a month. So that's based on a salary of £38,000 maximum. So anybody earning over £38,000 is going to be actually receiving slightly more of a reduction in their salary, because they will only be receiving up to that cap. So who's eligible? So we know that any UK employee with a bank account and a PAYE scheme is eligible. We know that much. Beyond that, it starts to get slightly more complicated. We know that small and medium businesses will be able to access the scheme. Large employers can only use the scheme if they pass a financial assessment test, which shows their turnover is lower now as a result of the pandemic. What we don't know is what that financial assessment test looks like yet. And we also don't know what constitutes a large employer. What we do know is with previous loans and things that have been available, they have used up to 45 million turnover to dictate that that's small or medium, although I have seen other figures on different accountancy websites around 38,000. So we don't know for definite, but we know the government have previously used this up to 45 million. So there's an assumption that it may be that. And obviously employees must be on the PAYE payroll on or before the 23rd of September. So you can ensure you put them on the day. But you do need to make sure that your RTI information has been submitted on or before that date as well. And I think that's something that's not necessarily completely clear everywhere, not just that they're on actually classed as being on the payroll, but that you have actually submitted that information to HMRC by the 23rd of September. So what constitutes a viable job? So it appears to be one where work is available, but at reduced levels over the winter months. And the scheme does say to be viable, the employee must work at least 33% of their usual hours and not be under notice of redundancy. So this minimum threshold will be reviewed at the end of January to see if it should be increased. In terms of testing viability, we know HMRC might audit employers at some point to confirm what the employee's normal contracted hours were against the reduced hours that they work under the scheme. So obviously that's something for you to be conscious of. What flexibility is built into the scheme? What we know so far is employees will be able to come on and off the scheme as long as they stay. Each short-term working arrangement lasts for a minimum of 7 days. We know that claims will be submitted in respect of any given pay period. So that's likely to mean if employees are paid on a monthly basis, then you need to show that they've worked for a third of the month. If they're paid weekly, you need to show that it's maybe a day and a half minimum thereabouts. And I did read an article where somebody said employers can reduce contractual hours. Can they reduce contractual hours in advance of putting them on the scheme? And again, they must be on the payroll, and it's those hours that are on the payroll that will be classed as the calculation that HMRC are going to refer to. So you need to consider what contractual hours your employees are on when they start the scheme, what they're going to be on for the period of the scheme. And for workers already on 0 hours contracts, government has said employers will be allowed to change their contracts to make them eligible for the scheme. However, it doesn't seem that there will be a requirement for you to do that. So I think we've had previously where as long as you can demonstrate an average payment or average hours and the previous 12 months, then that you've been able to class that as the hours that employee works. So it looks like that's going to be the same for this scheme. So what about tax, national insurance and pension? Well, Class 1 national insurance and pension contributions are going to remain payable by you. So that means that you're not only you paying that percentage of the pay, but actually you're also paying the NI and the pension for the whole salary. That is, if it was 77%, for example, you're paying the 77% national insurance and pension. But not tax. So nothing has been mentioned yet at all about tax. So my assumption is that you wouldn't have to contribute tax on the hours not worked, but I believe you're going to have to pay tax on the hours that the employee does work. It isn't in the guidance. I couldn't find anything about it, but my assumption is that's what it will be. Hopefully the guidance obviously will make that clearer. So just looking again at this graphic here, you can see this gives you a bit more information to help you look at what hours an employee might work, the hours then they're not working, the percentage of their earnings that they would receive overall, how much the government pays, and how much you pay. So I think this then helps you perhaps to sit down, do the maths and work out, actually, can I make it work to bring my employee back? And if I can, how is it going to work out to be the most cost effective in terms of how many hours I really need them to do and how much it's going to cost me and how much the government is going to be contributing. So I think when you look at this as, so I think I'd read it somewhere, a single adult homeowner earning £20,000 a year would face an income reduction of around 19% if they worked a third of their previous hours, which in that sense feels like it's not too bad for the employee, but for you as employers, obviously you're making up the maximum contribution of that. And actually, if they were on income support or universal credit, they would actually have a 70% drop in what they were receiving. So for employees, you can see how this is definitely going to be very attractive. For employers, obviously, it's going to be about looking at how much you need staff to work, how much it's going to cost you, and whether you can make it work. Now, lots of you will have probably seen in the press, lots has been said about the Resolution Foundation, who have done some calculations and have said if you pay £1,500 to one full-time worker on £17,000, it would cost you £1,500 to employ one full-time worker on £1,700, but more than £2,000 a month to employ two half-time workers on the same full-time equivalent salary. And if you move that to 3 part-time people sharing one FTE role, actually you end up paying 3 times the required 55%, which is 165% salary, which is obviously an extra 65% if you were employing a full-time person. Now, I fully anticipate that the government are going to respond to that in the updated guidance. I suspect we'll see some tweaks because clearly there's a real disincentive to keep part-time staff in the new scheme. And I think that not only obviously is that less favourable treatment, and I think that puts you as an employer potentially in a difficult position, but I think it would be seen to be really unfair to those who were lower paid. So I fully anticipate that they're going to address that within the new scheme. But as I say, all we can do is wait now for that scheme to become available. As you can see, I put a slide in here for updated guidance, but as I said, unfortunately, we haven't had any. So what we'll do is look to make some FAQs available once that updated guidance is released. And then moving on to varying contracts. So transitioning staff over to the new scheme. Covered this, as I said, in 2 different webinars previously, but I think it's really important, so I'm going to cover it again. As I said, I think the government makes the transition sound simple, but anybody who's varied a contract in the past knows that it's not that simple. So as we talked about before, if you've got layoff or we have got layoff. No, sorry, I'm on the wrong slide, apologies. So just looking at when you can make changes to the contract first. So layoff and short-term working is a time when you can make changes. When there's something in the contract already, for example, other flexibility clauses, when the employee agrees to the change, or when an employee's representative agrees to a change, and potentially you can force a change. And we'll cover that in a little bit more detail. So looking again at layoffs and short-term working, so many employment contracts have got in place a clause to cover layoffs. It's where you ask employees to stay at home or take unpaid leave because there's effectively not enough work for them. And even being asked not to work for one day is classed as a layoff. So it's potentially an option of flexibility that you do have available to you if it's already within the contract the employee has signed. Short-term working, again, this is you've already been doing this if you've been furloughing. So this is about cutting your employees' hours. And again, you may say there's a period of time where we don't have work available to you. You would have to have that clause in the contract already to be able to use it. And if not, then you need to agree the change with a member of staff. So you don't have an automatic right to invoke the clause. Basically, you need to agree and they need to understand what that actually means. You could potentially pay them guaranteed pay, but guaranteed pay is only a maximum of £30 a day, a maximum of 5 days over any period of short-term working. So it's only £150. If you were closing for a period of, let's say, 6 weeks, and there was no work for a period of 6 weeks, the employee obviously is not going to be able to survive on £150. So they may have to then access benefits. Another thing to be wary of if you're going to invoke the layoff or short-term working clause is if your employee is off for 4 or more weeks in a row, or 6 or more weeks in any 13-week period, they can actually apply for redundancy pay. Now, if you've got work for them within the next 4 weeks, you can say, no, I'm not going to pay that redundancy pay. I'm going to return you to work. But you do need to be aware, if you are going to invoke that clause, that they may make a claim after 4 weeks. So just a little bit on flexibility clauses. There's a few different ones built into the contract. Hours or days worked. So sometimes it's the flexibility, seasonal hours, or hours on a rota basis, for example, or days work. There may be some flexibility to move people around different days based on when you know you're more likely to require them. Rates of pay, again, sometimes they might get different rates of pay dependent on how much the company is making at any one time, or for different types of work. So that could be a way of potentially fluctuating and depending on the work available, having flexibility and different rates of pay available, moving people to different bases. If you have more than one site, again, being able to utilize them where you need them. But as I said, be mindful that you need to follow a process. If you need to give people notice, so even if those clauses exist, it's still expected that you might have to give them some notice to be able to make changes, and you might want to follow a process where you tell them this is what's going to be happening, and you give them a chance to highlight any issues. And the main reason I raise that is because, for example, if you were asking somebody to change their hours and they already had childcare commitments, they might need to make changes. If they've got other caring responsibilities, they might need to make changes. So you just need to make sure you're not indirectly discriminating against anybody in making the changes that you're proposing. So in any contract change, you need to consult. Particularly if you haven't got those clauses within the contract, this is about trying to get employees to agree to the change. So you have a discussion effectively, which helps you to demonstrate that you're taking on board what they've got to say about the proposed changes, and hopefully that reduces or prevents any potential legal action arising in the future. And it'll focus on the business case for change, why you need to make a change. They respond to that proposed business case, and you then hopefully reach a position whereby they've agreed with what you're proposing. There is guidance available, more detailed guidance on running a consultation process on the gov.uk website, and it is important that you do follow a set process. Even though if you're only making 1 or 2 employee changes, you might need to consider, you can do it fairly swiftly, but still try and follow the framework that's there just so that hopefully you can prove that it's been an open and transparent process, just in case you do get challenged on anything later on. And overall, just encourage your staff, if they're concerned, if they've got questions, that they can come to you, because you want to know what those problems might be in order that you can do something about them before it becomes a bigger problem. And the other thing to do is to make sure that you have got a written agreement of the changes. So you can write out a letter to confirm this is what's been agreed, and that would be perfectly acceptable. But I would advise preferably get a written agreement that has the employee's place for the employee's signature on it as well, and get them to sign it, because that's going to be much stronger in the future if you do get any challenges. Now, I've just put some points here which I covered last time, just because some people aren't aware of the Good Work Plan, because not a lot was said about it when it was introduced in April for obvious reasons. But if you are sending out new contracts, do make sure that you include what's required within the Good Work Plan. So have a look at that if you haven't already made yourself aware of it. And if changes can't be agreed, as I said, keep trying to make sure that the employee comes to you with any question. Consider alternative options that they produce, and make sure you document if you think they won't work, why. Make sure you follow procedures, particularly if somebody raises a grievance through the process. And if you think, then make sure you do properly consider anything that they suggest, because it may be that you could make some compromises and hopefully then get them on board. And if all else fails, you could consider dismissing them and offering them a new contract on the new terms. I would advise, if you are going to do that, you obviously only do it with legal support, because you will have to demonstrate lots of things before you get to that point to demonstrate that it's fair. Now, I'm mindful that we've actually come to the end of our 40 minutes. I'm going to be really brief and just tell you, I just thought I'd mention self-isolation payments, because they might be something that your staff might be able to access. So these are for individuals who are awaiting the results of a coronavirus test and have been told by the test and trace service to self-isolate. So they can only make this claim if they've had a test, and they can basically get a payment of £500, and they can do that even if they're on benefits already, if they're working part-time. In fact, it is for people who already qualify for state benefits, so it's likely to be useful potentially for part-time staff, maybe staff on universal credits. So the 5 criteria for staff to be able to claim is that they're in receipt of a particular credit, that they're employed or self-employed, that they're unable to work from home and will lose income, they've been told to self-isolate, and they must have had a test. And as I say, this one thing that's important about the self-isolation payment is that can be claimed on top of claiming SSP. So you would still pay SSP. The employee can claim the self-isolation payment on top. Now, I did say I was going to talk to you about the government kickstart scheme, but I don't want to eat into the time. But the only thing I'm going to say is that another thing for you to look at perhaps is the government kickstart scheme, because you may find that you can access some additional funding to support you to bring people into the company, as long as you can offer them opportunities to increase their skills over a period of 6 months. The government will cover their salary, and the government will pay you money to train them effectively. There's a few obviously hoops that you need to jump through, but it's certainly worth having a look at that. And certainly I'm aware of a few providers for different sectors. If people think that they might want some more information, I can certainly help with that. Okay, so your action plan. So to sit down and review how can you maximise the benefit from the furlough scheme in October, as we talked about. Review alternative options to employment that you might not have previously thought about, and then look at how can you use the job support scheme to retain jobs and minimise loss to your business. look at implementing, if appropriate, any contract clauses, or commence consultation on varying contracts if you haven't got those. And then formalise if there are any changes in writing, signing where agreed, and showing that the justification is clear in case it's challenged in the future. Okay, so I do have some opportunities available if people do need a little bit more support on this. Just drop me an email, leslie@lanska.co.uk, if you do feel that you need more support. I've got a couple of short slots available for individuals. And again, on the chat, if you do have questions that you didn't want to share with everybody, by all means, drop me an email and I can hopefully help you without you having to share your questions with everybody else. Okay, I'm not going to cover that one. Definitely, this is just a reminder about the forms that Lisa asked you to sign. And now we're on to questions. Okay, so Lisa, have you had questions?
I've got nothing on my chat to indicate, but I don't know if obviously there's a lot of information shared on there. So if anybody does have questions, do you want to bring yourself off mute and you can ask Lesley while she's here?
I can't see the chat function.
You haven't had anything put into your private. Oh, we got someone up there. Go on then, the floor is yours.
Lesley, you know, if people haven't been furloughed before, can they go on to the new scheme?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't look like it. No, it's. Right. I believe when it was first announced, the expectation was that potentially you could, but no, this scheme is for people who can show that they've already made a claim on furlough. Sorry, actually, I think I'm getting confused. Sorry, between that and the bonus scheme. Actually, you're right. You can go on this scheme if you haven't previously been on furlough. Sorry.
Oh, right. Okay. Because it's a bit unclear. It's not really, you know.
No, it's a good point. Actually, I should have covered that. Yeah, but it's the bonus scheme that staff have. You can only claim that if staff were previously on furlough. With the job support scheme, they don't have to have been previously on furlough. So, and it is a very different scheme, isn't it, for employers?
Because now this is just random thinking, right? So it's not out there. Because we got we got X amount of staff on furlough. Now, if they come back into the workforce, we were thinking reducing other people's work time and to bring other people in so they can have their work time. Do you know what I mean? You know, as opposed to redundant, you know.
Yeah, so you're almost sort of recycling your staff so that some people can be taken off and some people can come back. And I think lots of people used the furlough scheme that way, didn't they? When you could bring people back part-time in particular. So it's a similar principle. As long as they're working for a 7-day period, then you're reducing their hours, but at least it has to be at least a third that they're doing. Then you can do it this way. I think if you're bringing them back close to full time, obviously one of the things to look at when we saw that infographic that showed if they're working 50%, 60 or 70%, the government's contribution starts to go down and down and down. So if you're bringing them back full-time hours or, you know, their full-time contract, then potentially you're not going to get as much support available.
Yeah, there's not enough work coming in to cover their salaries. So you're in that kind of, well, if you drag them in, you know, there's not going to be enough work, and then you jeopardize not having enough money to pay them.
I think that's a little bit the flaw of the scheme, unfortunately. It's almost going to be the employers who can afford to use it are going to be able to use it. The employers who don't have a lot of work and have still got quite a few staff potentially are going to struggle to get the full benefit out of it, I think. but again, you've got to sit down and do the maths, and that's where as I said, you need to be thinking about maybe if you don't think you're going to be able to utilise the scheme, you're utilising furlough now. Potentially, you need to be looking at starting redundancy process now.
Well,
you can still potentially.
We did get rid of some, but we had to. But you don't want to, because you've trained them up and you want to keep them. It's not nice getting rid of people. They become a part of the team.
Again, look at the options again. See if there's some. You can find some secondment opportunities for them, or see if some individuals might fall with unpaid leave so that you can retain them, because they can still potentially claim benefits over that period. So it might be worth having a look at that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you ever so much. Anybody else have questions? Oh, I can see the chat function now, so we might have.
Yeah, I've got nothing on my ones. I don't know if anyone's got them privately to you.
Yeah, so I've got a question. I'm not going to say from who, around working child credits, tax credits, cancer benefit for the self-isolation payment. Now, I don't believe child credits does. Let me double check, because I have got a little list here. Actually, working tax credit does. If you're on working tax credit, then you could be entitled to claim the self-isolation payment. Yeah. Okay, so does anybody else have a question?
No. You must have covered everything.
Lisa and I were thinking with all these people that we might run over time with.
I know, we were panicking, but obviously you've such a presenter there that you've packed all the information that they need in there. So and obviously you've given your details there if anybody did want to ask a question but would rather come direct to you as well. So just a reminder then, the forms that will be coming out to you, if you could get them sent back into me as soon as possible, that would be fab. I haven't had any ideas coming up on the chat facility either for any future webinars, but again, if you do have any topics that you would love to see covered to help you and your business, then when I send out the webinar feedback email, maybe you could just send a reply back to me with any ideas that you have on there, and I can forward them on then to our team then to process those. I think anything else you want to say, Lesley, or everyone's dying for a cup of hours, so much information there.
I think, as you said, people have got, people have got questions they think of afterwards. You've got my contact details, and I think it's going to be when we get a bit more detail around the scheme, we might have more questions. That's what happened with furlough. We had something like 30 versions of the furlough guidance, so we could well look out for it could end up with lots of different iterations of this as well.
Yes, and then possibly, like you said, a second webinar there. But thanks, Lesley, for taking the time out this morning, and everybody else for giving your time up. So all that's left to say, I think, is enjoy your Friday and your weekends, and hopefully you're not restricted too much like we are up in the RCT, and you could go out and do things. So have a good weekend, everybody. Thanks, Lesley. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.